Hello and welcome to Insight Ophthalmology. This is Dr. Amrit and I welcome you to another lecture on pupillary pathways. Under this lecture, we are going to study about what is direct and consensual light reflex, what is the pathway of the light reflex, what are the various pupillary muscles, that is the sphincter pupillae and the dilator pupillae, and finally we are going to talk about the nerve supply of these pupillary muscles, that is the sympathetic and the parasympathetic supply of the pupillary muscles. The pupils basically participate in several reflexes. However, three of them are of clinical significance to us: the light reflex, the near reflex, and the psychosensory reflex. Starting with the light reflex is nothing but whenever light enters an eye, the pupil of that eye as well as the pupil of the other eye will constrict in reaction to this light. This is called the light reflex. Whenever we look at an object from far to near, there will be constriction of the pupil, and this is called the near reflex. Coming to the psychosensory reflex, it is nothing but it is a dilatation of the pupil that will occur on psychic and sensory stimulus. So the light reflex and the near reflex, we have constriction of the pupil, and in psychosensory reflex we have dilatation of the pupil. The light reflex is of particular importance to us, and whenever testing for light reflex, 3 points should be considered in our mind. This is, for number 1, the illumination of the room should always be low. Number 2, the patient should be looking at the distance. Number 3, the light should be focused and bright light. The light reflex is of two types: the direct pupillary light reflex and the consensual pupillary light reflex. Constriction of the pupil to which the light is shown is called the direct pupillary reflex. However, the constriction of the other's eye to which the light is not shown in response to the opposite eye in which the light is shown is called consensual pupillary reflex. That means if we show light to this eye and this eye is also getting constricted along with this, the response that we see in the contralateral eye is called consensual pupillary reflex. So what I mean to say is that if this is the right eye and this is the left eye, and I have a torch with which I am showing light to the right eye, the right eye will actually constrict in response to the direct light which is thrown inside it, and this reflex is called the direct pupillary reflex of the right eye because I am throwing light directly in the right eye. However, the left eye also will constrict in response to the light which is thrown in the right eye, and that response is called the left eye consensual pupillary reflex because it is consensually or indirectly responding to the light which is sent in the other eye. Now let us talk about the light reflex pathway. At this point, I want to clarify that the visual pathway is totally different from the light reflex pathway, although they share certain similar structures in common. The visual pathway video is already there on my channel and I will put the link in the description for you to follow that before. So coming to the light reflex pathway, they are specifically associated with the light reflex which we are getting from the pupil. However, visual pathway is associated with the various components of the vision, the 5 components of vision. Okay, so they are different. The light reflex pathway also consists of an afferent, a center, and then an efferent. So in our visual pathway, what was happening was the temporal part of the retina, which was carrying the nasal field, was going into the optic nerve and then into the optic chiasm. But in the optic chiasm, they were not crossing like the nasal fibers. Then they will go into the optic tract and then into the lateral geniculate body, which was present at the end of the optic tract. From there, they were going into the optic radiations, and finally, they were reaching the visual cortex. Right? Similarly, the nasal fibers, what was happening to the nasal fiber? The nasal fiber of the opposite side was coming into the optic nerve and then it was crossing in the optic chiasm and coming to this optic tract, going into the lateral geniculate body, optic radiation, and finally the cortex. The same thing was happening in the other eye also. That is the nasal fibers were the one which were crossing, and the temporal fibers were the one which will not cross and pass just like that traveling the optic nerve, chiasm, optic tract, lateral geniculate body, and finally reaching the visual cortex. What happens differently in this light reflex is that few of the fibers from the optic tract, they will take a D route and they will go to this structure in golden here, present in the midbrain, and this structure is called the pretectal nucleus. Right? So both the fibers, whether it is nasal fibers or it is a temporal fibers, they are going to go and relay in the pretectal nucleus in the midbrain of the either side, taking D route from the optic tract, and they are not going to go to these lateral geniculate bodies to which the visual pathway was going. Right? So this is the difference. All the fibers are not going to go to the lateral geniculate body. Instead, some of them are going to come out from the optic tracts and go to the pretectal nucleus present in the midbrain near the superior colliculus. Right? The afferent part of the light reflex starts right from here, that is from the retina, and from the retina up to the pretectal nucleus of the either side. So this will form the afferent part or the afferent limb of the light reflex. The pretectal nucleus is connected with the structures present in the midbrain anterior to it, and these structures are called the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. Okay, and they are actually the main centers of relay in the light pathway. Now the pretectal nucleus of both the sides will send the fibers to both the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. So there is a crossing. So what happens is, suppose this is the pretectal nucleus, it will send fiber to this Edinger-Westphal nucleus and also to this Westphal nucleus. Similarly, the other pretectal nucleus also will be sending fibers to both the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. So these neurons which are going to both the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, they are called the internuncial neurons, and they are the ones which are responsible for our direct and consensual light reflex. So what do I mean to say is that whenever we put light to one eye, the other eye is also showing the light reflex. Why is the other eye showing light reflex? The reason is because of the presence of these internuncial neurons. Because of that, when one eye is also stimulated, the information is going to go to the other eye also because of the crossing present at the level of because of the crossing which is present in between the pretectal and the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. Finally, we have the efferent limb of the light reflex. The efferent pathway consists of basically the parasympathetic fibers which are arising from this Edinger-Westphal nucleus of both the sides, and these the parasympathetic fibers which are coming from the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, they are present in close relation to the third cranial nerve. Okay, and they are going to travel in one of the roots of the third cranial nerve and go up to the ganglion which is present on the either side of the eye, and this ganglion is called the ciliary ganglion. Okay, so now they're going to relay in the ciliary ganglion, and from the ciliary ganglion they will finally go and supply the sphincter pupillae using the short ciliary nerves. So finally we have the short ciliary nerves which will go and supply the sphincter pupillae. So this is what is meant by the efferent limb of the light reflex. There are basically two pupillary muscles which are present in the pupil, which are associated with the reactions of the pupil. So the first pupillary muscle is the sphincter pupillae, which is present in circular manner around the pupil. Okay, and this sphincter pupillae is under the control of our parasympathetic system. However, we have another muscle which is called the dilator pupillae, and the dilator pupillae is under the control of our sympathetic system. So the constrictor pupillae is actually present around the pupil in concentric circles and therefore bring about the constriction of the pupil, whereas the dilator pupillae is actually arranged radially across the pupil. So whenever these radial muscles are going to contract under the influence of the sympathetic system, what happens is that the pupil will actually dilate, and because of the dilatation action, it is called dilator pupillae. Now, another difference between the two pupillary muscles is with respect to the ciliary nerves, which are actually going to go and supply these muscles. So the sphincter pupillae, you can remember it as a mnemonic, that it is supplied by the short ciliary nerves. On the contrary, the dilator pupillae, which is supplied by the sympathetic system, is getting its nerve supply from the long ciliary nerve. Okay, so for the sphincter pupillae, it is the short posterior ciliary nerve, and for the dilator pupillae, it is the long posterior ciliary nerve. Now let us talk about the parasympathetic supply of the pupil. As I already told you that it is the sphincter pupillae which is supplied by the parasympathetic system. So the sphincter is supplied by the cholinergic nerves of the parasympathetic system, which is basically coming using the third cranial nerve. So let me tell you how does it happen. As I already mentioned that few of the fibers were coming out of the optic tract and they were going into the pretectal nucleus, which was present in the midbrain. The pretectal nucleus will send fibers into both the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, that is Edinger-Westphal nucleus of both the sides. The Edinger-Westphal nucleus is present near the aqueduct of Sylvius and also is in very close relationship with the third nerve nucleus. Therefore, these fibers coming from the Edinger-Westphal nucleus will now be traveling inside the oculomotor nerve, which is the third cranial nerve. When these fibers will reach the cavernous sinus, the division of the third cranial nerve will take place. The third cranial nerve will again be dividing into the superior division and the inferior division. Now we know that the superior division of the oculomotor nerve will go and supply the superior rectus muscle and the levator palpebrae superioris. However, the inferior division of the third cranial nerve will go and supply the medial rectus, the inferior rectus, and the inferior oblique muscle. Now, the fibers which are coming from the Edinger-Westphal nucleus are going into the third cranial nerve, and then they are going to travel in the inferior division of the third cranial nerve, especially to the part which is going and supplying the inferior oblique muscle. Okay, traveling to the inferior oblique muscle branch. From this side, they are going to go and relay in an important ganglion which is present lateral to the eyeball, between the eyeball and the lateral rectus muscle, and this ganglion is called the ciliary ganglion, and this pathway till the level of ciliary ganglion is called the preganglionic parasympathetic pathway for the light reflex. After relaying in the ciliary ganglion, the postganglionic fibers will start from the ciliary ganglion, and now they are going to exit through the short root of the ciliary ganglion, and as they exit out of the short root of the ciliary ganglion, now they will be called the short ciliary nerves. So these short ciliary nerves are going to go towards the eyeball and pierce the sclera near the optic nerve and travel between the sclera and the choroid, and now they are going to travel forwards. Now the short ciliary nerves are actually about 8 to 10 in number, which will further subdivide and form almost about 20 in number. So 20 short posterior ciliary nerves can actually be present, and the short ciliary nerves will now go traveling between the sclera and the choroid and will be supplying two basic muscles. Number one is the ciliary muscle, and number two is the sphincter pupillae, which will cause constriction of the pupil. Now at this point, it is very important to know that almost out of these 20 ciliary nerves which are present, almost 95% will be supplying the ciliary muscle. okay, and only 5% of these short ciliary nerves will go and supply the sphincter pupillae. So this was about the parasympathetic supply of the pupil, which is coming mainly from the edingovespal nucleus, traveling in the inferior division of the third cranial nerve, going up to the ciliary ganglion, and from the ciliary ganglion traveling in the short ciliary nerves, and finally going into the sphincter pupillary muscle. Now let us talk about the sympathetic nerve supply of the pupil. As I already told you that it is the dilator pupillae which is supplied by the sympathetic nerve supply, and it is happening via the long ciliary nerves. The center of the sympathetic nerve supply starts from the hypothalamic center. The hypothalamic center will give inhibitory impulses to the edingovespal nucleus. Now, I already told you that the edingovespal nucleus is mainly associated with the parasympathetic nerve supply. That means supply of the sphincter pupillae, okay, which is associated with the constriction of the pupil. Therefore, the hypothalamic center, what does it do first is that it will cause inhibition of the edingovespal nucleus. Now from this hypothalamic centers, the fibers are going to go and pass up to the ciliospinal center of the budge. It is also called the ciliospinal center of budge, which is basically found by the C8, T1, T2, T3 and T4. However, as it reaches from the hypothalamus to this center of budge, there will be a decussation which will occur at the level of the midbrain, so that the hypothalamic center of one side will be giving the impulses to both the ciliocentral spinal of budge. That means there will be a bilateral innervation in the sympathetic system also. Now, the fibers are going to leave through these ventral rami of C8, T1, T2, T3, T4. That means they are leaving now from the ciliospinal center of budge, and they will now be traveling in the cervical chain. That is a sympathetic chain which is present in our neck. That's why it is called cervical chain. Now they are going to travel without relaying through the inferior cervical ganglion, middle cervical ganglion, and finally they are going to reach a point of relay. And this point of relay is the superior cervical ganglion, right? So the preganglionic sympathetic fibers are going to relay where? In the superior cervical ganglion. Now from this level, the postganglionic fibers will start. Okay, so now after they emerge from the superior cervical ganglion, they are going to now enter the skull. Okay, now as they enter the skull, they are going to come across the internal carotid artery, and they are going to coil around the carotid artery. Now this is called the carotid plexus. Okay, now from here they are going to go up to the cavernous sinus. Let us imagine this box to be actually the cavernous sinus. Okay, so what happens is, as they are coming out of the superior cervical ganglion, as the postganglionic nerve fibers, sympathetic nerve fibers, they will go and coil around the internal carotid artery, okay, which is now coming, which is actually entering now the cavernous sinus, right? Now, in the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus, there are three nerves which are traveling. That is the third cranial nerve, the fourth cranial nerve, and we also have the first division of the fifth cranial nerve, that is the ophthalmic division of the fifth cranial nerve. So what happens is, from this carotid plexus, now these fibers are going to come in close contact with the V1 division of the fifth cranial nerve, and now they are going to start passing through this. Now I have tried to represent the same thing in this diagram. So the structure over here, which is drawn in yellow, is nothing but the trigeminal ganglion, which is also called the Gasserian ganglion. Okay, so now the trigeminal ganglion basically has three divisions. That is the V1 division, which is the ophthalmic division, the V2 division, which is the maxillary division, and the V3 division, which is the mandibular division. The ophthalmic division is associated basically with the eye, which travels in the cavernous sinus. So our fibers are going to go and pass over this ganglion. Okay, so they are not relaying in this Gasserian ganglion. Don't get confused. The sympathetic fibers are relaying where? They are relaying in the superior cervical ganglion. So they are going to just pass like that near the Gasserian ganglion, and finally they are going to enter where? In the V1 division in the cavernous sinus. That means in the ophthalmic division. Now from the ophthalmic division, where will they pass? So for that, you need to know that the ophthalmic division is again dividing into various branches. Okay, so it is dividing into the lacrimal branch, which will go supply the lacrimal gland and again subdivide, and one is the frontal branch, and then we have a nasociliary branch also, which is again going to subdivide into further branches, right? But there is one important branch of the nasociliary that we must remember is, and that is the long ciliary nerve. Okay, so now what happens is, from the Gasserian ganglion traveling above the Gasserian ganglion, it will enter the V1 division, that is the ophthalmic division, and from the ophthalmic division these nerves will decide to go in the nasociliary branch, and from the nasociliary branch they will enter the long ciliary nerves. Okay, so after going into the long ciliary nerves, these nerves will actually pierce the sclera and travel between the sclera and the choroid, and finally supply our dilator pupillae and cause dilatation of the pupil. So now if you see carefully, ciliary ganglion is present over here, but what is happening? The long ciliary nerves have almost no relationship with this ciliary ganglion. Okay, so our sympathetic nerve supply of the pupil, the sympathetic nerves are not going into the ciliary ganglion. It was the parasympathetic nerves, that is the short ciliary nerves, which were coming out of the ciliary ganglion. The long ciliary nerves carrying the sympathetic system will not go into the ciliary ganglion. So this was about the sympathetic supply of the pupil. Okay, so starting from the hypothalamus, so hypothalamus spinal tract, going to the celospinal center of Budge, from there going to the superior cervical ganglion, going to the carotid plexus, from there going to the V1 division, that is the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal, going into the nasociliary, finally from the nasociliary the long ciliary nerve going to supply the dilator pupillae. So I hope this was clear and useful. Thank you and have a nice day.